Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to see so many people joining us for this month's Learning and Development session on the suicide prevention policy landscape. Welcome to all of those who are joining us for the first time, and welcome back to all of you who joined us on the very first session last month. My name is Nicola Parry. I'm the Head of Lived Experience, Engagement and Integration at Roses in the Ocean, and I'm joined by my team member, Julia Granahan, and we'll be your hosts for today's session. If you'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce yourselves in the chat, we'd love to see who's online with us today. We're joined by two extraordinary contributors today, Stephen Scott, General Manager of Strategy and Policy at Roses in the Ocean, and Caroline Allen, who's a member of the Roses in the Ocean's Policy Committee, and they'll be taking the floor very shortly. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters that we live, work and dream on, and acknowledge that we're all coming from different lands today. Julia and I are coming to you from the Yagara and Turrbal people's country on Mianjin land, and we pay our respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us on this session today. We also acknowledge everyone's lived experience of suicide and thank everyone for your individual insights, knowledge, and expertise that you bring to this session today and to the suicide prevention more broadly. And before we make the introductions that you've all been waiting for, I'll pass to Julia, who'll take us through a few housekeeping guidelines for this session. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. So this session is going to be focused on looking on the foundations of suicide prevention policy landscape throughout Australia and how we can come together to influence policy to create positive change. We will finish with an open Q&A section, and you're very welcome to submit questions throughout the session, but please note that these won't be responded to until the end. To submit a question, please keep in mind that you will need to use the Q&A aspect of the webinar, not the chat, as that won't be moderated as we go throughout the session. And we will do our absolute best to address as many questions as possible throughout today's session. But if we don't get a chance to come to you, we will make sure that we will reach out to you in the next coming days with a response to your questions.
Thanks, Julia. Well, without further ado, I'll pass to Stephen and Caroline. Thanks, Stephen. Stephen will start us off.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Julia. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this webinar, which I hope you will all find very interesting. I'm very much looking forward to your questions later and to the discussion, of course, with Caroline. However, I've got just a few slides to take you through very quickly, first of all. So I'll just share my screen and get my presentation up there. So you should be seeing an opening slide there, suicide prevention policy and introduction. Now, looking at just a bit of an overview for what I'll be covering just in these next few minutes. Here is a bit of an outline. So first of all, what is policy and how is it useful? We'll be looking at what we refer to as policy instruments at both national and state levels. A couple of just basic concepts in policy to help orientate us all a little bit more. And then we're going to look at the differences between Commonwealth and state and territory responsibilities or governance in particular. And we'll look into that a little bit more shortly. I wanted to forecast for all of you a current major opportunity to help shape national policy. So we'll talk about that briefly as well. And then lastly, how you can influence policy in your own world, in your own area, with your own governments or health services and others. So firstly, what is policy and how is it useful? So policy sets a set of rules for what is going to be years, including what is going to be prioritised for funding. So policy is very important because it sets down the foundations or the ground rules for how, in our case, suicide prevention is going to be managed and implemented over a certain period of time. It also recognises who has a stake in the issue at hand, and this is often referred to as stakeholders. You'll hear that term around quite a bit, and clarifies what their role is. So from our perspective, from the perspective of people with lived experience of suicide, we need to see ourselves referred to in policy so that when it comes to implementation, we have access to the decision-making, the design of services, reform initiatives, research activities, government policy making, for example, in itself. So it is critical that we see ourselves reflected in these policies, whether they be at state or national level or at a regional or local level. And in terms of the goal for our movement for people with lived experience of suicide, what we're looking for, rather than excessive amounts of text written about us, is just small but powerful directions that place people with lived experience of suicide at the centre of suicide prevention. It's really important that these directions, or sometimes they'll be referred to as recommendations, might have another term, but that they be specifically linked to actions and they speak to how people with lived experience will actually be involved. So not just motherhood statements, or which mean kind of, general but fairly meaningless statements in the opening paragraphs or opening pages of a policy. We really need to see ourselves down in the guts of the policy itself, not just sort of listed at the top as being important, but not actually linked to any specific actions. Now, here is a range of suicide prevention policies and plans, or what we call policy instruments, which basically means, these are the documents themselves. You'll see first on that list is the National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement. This is an agreement which is somewhat different to the rest of the pieces of policy there on the screen. But I thought it was important to just include this because this is an agreement between the Commonwealth Government and the states and territories for, in our context, in the suicide prevention context, the funding of aftercare, post-vention services and the distress brief support trials that are taking place on the eastern seaboard over the next couple of years. So that is a very important, relatively new, but nonetheless very important piece of policy within our space that everyone should have an awareness of. Next on that list is the National Suicide Prevention Strategy, which is coming. It will be released for public consultation very soon, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. It's planned to go out actually for the next 10 years, so it will extend well past 2029 and into the next decade. The rest of the list there, you will see the name of your state or territory and something like a strategic framework or a plan or a suicide prevention framework. A range of names are given to these different policy instruments that you will have in your state or territory. Don't get too caught up on the difference between a strategy, strategic framework, a plan, etc. These things kind of roll in trends. They're not necessarily important differences to be investigating. Essentially, these are the state and at the top of the screen, national policy instruments that we all need to have some awareness of. Now, just for some quite basic concepts here. So the policy window, John Kingdon wrote about this in 2011, and he referred to a policy window being open when three conditions are met. The problem being well understood by government and experts, in our case, that includes people with lived experience of suicide and the broader community. Secondly, that the solution to the problem needs to be available and feasible. And thirdly, that the political will has to be present at the right time. And so Kingdon's concept here is that this policy window opens when these opportunities to change policy present themselves. And there's a few examples I've given there, some historical examples such as the gun reforms that took place in the wake of Port Arthur about 25 years ago now. The creation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme would be another example. And some recent examples from our field would include the reduction of seclusion and restraint in mental health units around the country. We know that's been a really important policy direction. And the National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement itself, which I mentioned there, that sets out how different suicide prevention initiatives are going to be funded around the country. And the current window is the development of the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. So we will explore a little bit more how you can participate in that current opportunity to change policy as well. Just very briefly, I wanted to mention this concept of the policy cycle. This is an Australian invention. You can see it's been around for almost 25 years now. The actual steps themselves are of less importance than the major point of this, that policy runs in a continuous cycle, that there will be the creation of policy instruments, there'll be a range of consultation and coordination and decision-making, followed by implementation and evaluation. That evaluation will identify certain issues, there'll be some policy analysis, and then moving on to the development of more policy instruments. And just to kind of break that down a little bit, I like to think of policy as consisting of these three unique stages of development, implementation, and evaluation, which is itself meant to operate as a cycle in itself. Sometimes policy can be assumed to involve the development of a policy only, and not so much its implementation or its evaluation. But importantly, policy does not end with just the completion of a policy or strategy. Really, it's the implementation and evaluation of that policy, which is at least as important, if not more important, than the written policy itself. Now, just to go to some details here about what we refer to as governance. You may hear that term around the place as well. Generally, it can be simplified to meaning decision-making. So how are decisions made? Who is making those decisions? Now, just at the Commonwealth level, we have the Health Minister, and most people would be aware of him. It's Mark Butler at the moment. We also have an Assistant Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. Her name's Emma McBride. Although she has this Assistant Minister role, the Health Minister retains very important powers in relation to suicide prevention because of his financial responsibilities. So he, particularly the Health Minister, has the final call and basically where the funds go ultimately. But the Assistant Minister also has a really important role in liaising with the sector and developing policy with the sector and with people who have lived experience. At the moment in Australia, just in the last couple of years since we've had the National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement, there has also been a governance structure, and you might hear that term around a little as well, referred to as the Senior Officers Group. These are chief psychiatrists and senior executives from all of the state and territory health departments. There are some lived experience representatives on that group though as well. And yes, as I said, so they're mostly made up of that membership there of the chief psychiatrists and senior health bureaucrats. Just looking at the states and territories, likewise, there is a health minister in every state and territory. In most cases, there is also a minister for mental health, or it may be a minister for mental health and suicide prevention. Some of the smaller jurisdictions will just have a health minister, but that health minister will also have responsibilities for mental health and suicide prevention as part of that portfolio. Then at the state and territory level, we, in most cases, have some type of governance structure as well. In examples like South Australia and Tasmania, it's referred to as a Ministerial Advisory Committee. In Queensland and New South Wales, there are what's referred to as whole of government groups established, which tend to be senior representatives from a range of government agencies, not just health, but a range of agencies that contribute to suicide prevention in different ways. So it might include the Education Department, Housing, Treasury, a number of others. And just a final point there, that there are many differences regarding those structures, and even that relationship between there being a health minister and minister for mental health in different states and territories. So please have a look at your own local context where you are. Your state and territory suicide prevention strategy or framework will often refer to those governance structures in the state or territory as well. So in addition to that previous slide, it's important for us just to have a general understanding of what some of the different responsibilities are between Commonwealth and states and territories. The Commonwealth is responsible for general practice, so all of the doctors and GPs that are accessible around the country, and also the Better Access program. This is the program through which mental health care plans are delivered, and people can access some subsidised psychology appointments there. The primary health networks are also part of the Commonwealth government. I find the best way to refer to those is as kind of local branches of the Commonwealth government, particularly of the health department. I know my friend and colleague Caroline here will also refer to the primary health networks as middlemen who are passing funds from the Commonwealth government into the hands of local organisations. Looking at the states and territories, they are responsible for hospitals, for the delivery of hospitals, the running of hospitals, and therefore they will also have responsibility for the running of their own more local branches, if you will, like local health districts in New South Wales or health and hospital networks in Queensland. There will be different names for those structures in your state and territory as well, so please check that out. But they are similar structures across each state and territory. Both levels of government, so both the states and territories and the Commonwealth, fund non-government organisations to deliver services. Usually the Commonwealth has a lot more funding available though, and they will fund national initiatives around the country, and the states will fund statewide initiatives. And just lastly, that local point there as well, that primary health networks do have those Commonwealth funds for local purposes as well. Now, just to conclude or get very close to conclusion here, I mentioned that we have this current policy window open at the moment regarding the new national strategy for suicide prevention. So a draft strategy is going to be released for a consultation period of, we understand, about 6 to 8 weeks very shortly. In fact, this is going to be commencing imminently. Roses in the Ocean will be providing opportunities for people with lived experience of suicide to contribute to and help us out with our response to the strategy, but also to be informed about what the strategy is likely to say as well. We intend to focus on the implementation of the strategy and how that should be done from a lived experience perspective, and not only on what is written in the strategy document itself. So that will be the scope of what we will be focusing on, both the written words in the strategy, but also on issues regarding the implementation of those words in the strategy. And there'll be more information to come from Roses in the Ocean about how you can participate in that process. And just finally, how can I influence policy? Here are just a few tips to get started. This is by no means exhaustive. Start local and focus on what is happening in your region first. and understand what your state or territory strategy or plan will mean or should mean for your local community. You can write to the government yourself. You can write to your local Commonwealth or state or territory MP or your state or territory minister as well. In terms of starting local, the primary health networks are a good place to start, as are the mental health commissions in all of the states as well. And asking them, what lived experience opportunities do you have available? And they may be things like advisory committees, co-design activities, procurement panels, where you're looking at proposals that have been given to the primary health network or the commission and giving advice on those. You can often get onto email lists of newsletters and updates and notifications as well, which can be really helpful. Even if the Mental Health Commission or the Primary Health Network don't really know how to involve you or other people with lived experience of suicide, maintain contact with them nonetheless. Many primary health networks and mental health commissions are still developing their abilities to work with people who have lived experience of suicide, both in terms of how they do that, as well as the opportunities that they make available. You can refer to, and you should refer to, the relevant national or state and territory strategies to support your request, because everywhere around the country now, at both the national and at all of the state and territory levels, the involvement of people with lived experience of suicide is explicitly written into these policies. So there is clear grounds for people with lived experience to make these requests to be involved. And if you're in a state or territory where the strategy or plan has already been developed and you might be halfway through its implementation period, then focus on the implementation and evaluation until the new strategy or plan is being developed. Don't wait, 2 or 3 years to see if you can get involved in a co-design session. There's a lot that can be looked at in terms of whether what is being stated in these policies is being delivered through implementation as well, and also how that's being evaluated. Now, those are all the slides I have for you, but I am very excited now to bring in my friend and colleague, Caroline Allen, to have a chat about these ideas. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen there. Caroline, you've been privy to this presentation, of course, and you're very experienced in the policy world. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. So what do you think?
I think you did a beautiful presentation, Stephen. I thought it was so neatly set out and it was so sequential and it looked like everything runs so smoothly. That is so not my experience of being involved in policy. And yeah, I think maybe we just left out the minor little points of the frustration and the going round and round in circles and how slow things can be. And I guess that's the balance of the theory, and it looks so good, and the experience. Because yeah, this space can be really, really hard work.
Definitely, and I'm glad that you have started off with that point, because certainly what I've presented here is theoretical in nature. This may be how things are supposed to proceed according to all of the theory and research and methodology and so on. But we know what happens in practice can often not look like this at all. I think it's why many people with lived experience of suicide need to have some of this grounding, I guess, so that some of the corners that can be cut or the compromises that are made are well understood for what they actually are, for those compromises or corners being cut.
Yeah, like, I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned early on was the idea of sort of getting small little ideas put into policy. And I think certainly when I started out, I thought the idea was that we write the whole thing and it's all about lived experience from start to finish. And again, that just isn't the reality. as you go along, you realize that it's really exciting if you get one sentence in there emphasizing lived experience. So I think in terms of being able to sit in this space long term, it is important to sort of understand what is realistic and what is achievable, because it certainly would be very easy to get burnt out and discouraged. It's certainly a marathon and not a sprint.
Yes, yeah, that's a very appropriate analogy to give there, and I think as well supports that awareness of what the responsibilities for these different levels of government really are. I think sometimes, you know, of course, people with lived experience, we're all bringing our personal lives to this. The stakes for us are exceptionally high. So we do want to change the world. We do want to change the world immediately as well. We know that that needs to happen urgently so that others don't experience the kinds of things that we've experienced. All of that is not going to happen quickly. And if you're working at the level of the state government or the Commonwealth government, it is really important that you speak to them about the responsibilities that they can actually accrete, not about things that other levels of government are responsible for, not least because the first thing they'll do is just shunt the responsibility off to those other levels of government.
Yeah, and I think that is something that I've noticed sort of in committees and as new people, new lived experience people come in, I think that is a super important thing for people to get their head around. And it certainly took me quite a while to understand what is state responsibility and what is federal. And I know, like, it probably sounds ridiculous, but one of the ways that I sort of started to get my head around it was like I'd look at a website and see whether it had the federal logo or the state logo. And that sort of helped me to understand and get my head around it. And you're right that it is important in committees because you can, like sometimes I see sort of staff and that getting frustrated because the people with lived experience are very enthusiastic and passionate and saying we should be doing this and this and this, but the staff are going, well, we can't, that's a federal issue. We simply have no power. So that tends to then sort of create that division and staff not getting discouraged about having that lived experience. So that, to me, that is super important for people coming into the space, trying to wrap your head around what is federal and what is state.
Right.
Issue.
Yeah, and I think to build on that as well, that distinction between those local area networks or districts or health and hospital services, there'll be a whole range of names for them, and the primary health networks as well, because there will be policy level work taking place at those local and regional levels too. But likewise, we have to have an understanding of what is within the power of those organisations to have influence over. For the primary health networks, it will be quite different to those state government equivalents as well.
And where it gets really exciting is when you have joint projects where the states and the federal government have been asked to work together. So this is, I always talk about this. This is like the highlight of my involvement, is the magical Joint Regional Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan. So this was, it was in New South Wales. I don't know if it's across the other states, but certainly in New South Wales, every local health district and every PHN were told by the respective governments that they have to come up with a joint regional mental health and suicide prevention plan. And so in my particular area, we are now, it started in 2018, and we are now up to the plan of the plan of the plan of the plan, which I just love. So in 2018, we started with the foundation plan, and then the foundation plan begot the strategic plan, and the strategic plan begot the implementation plan, and the implementation plan begot the operational plan. Therefore, the operational plan is the plan of the plan of the plan of the plan, and that's where we're at. So in terms of getting involved in policy, this is the sort of exciting stuff you can do. That's the highlight of my policy adventures, the plan of the plan of the plan of the plan.
It's I mean, it's an outlandish example, but of course it is a real world example.
Really, truly.
And it's a really pertinent one as well, because this new national strategy, of course, is replacing the 5th National Mental Health Plan, of which those regional mental health and suicide prevention plans were an important part. Now, I am aware that there's a lot of variation around the country as to whether they have even been done and whether they've been done successfully, and whether they've been done to the point where they can actually be reasonably implemented. Now, the example you've given there, Caroline, is absolutely an example of what not to do. It's very much an example of what we should not be seeing. Policy is not an excuse not to do something. In fact, it's intended to catalyse action. So whenever I hear of stories like, an Escher painting of plans and frameworks and plans that state there needs to be another plan developed, this is not good policy practice. This is really immobilising, actually, and certainly from a lived experience of suicide perspective, I can totally appreciate why that would be a very demoralising experience. We need to make sure that our involvement in policy is all about generating action, not simply to generate more policy.
And I think that's the thing, like I know someone has described it as a set of babushka dolls, that you open a plan and there's another plan, and you open that one and there's another plan. And you're right, like you talked about like those 3 key stages, which include implementation and evaluation. And in my experience, they often do get missed. That I was reflecting on this earlier today, that I started in this space in about 2017, and I'm not sure that I can really think of an example of something having been evaluated, which is really sad. That it does seem to be that we go, yes, finally, we finished our policy, we'll put it on the bookshelf up there. It's so, yeah, like I don't know how we change it. Maybe you have ideas about how we change it, like, because to me, like that is a super challenge. And I guess it reminds me, I was thinking of something else, that in one space that I move in, the government demands that they do a needs assessment every year or 2. And every time they talk about doing this needs assessment, I raise the question, well, what have we achieved from the last needs assessment? Have we ticked off those things and met those needs? Because if we haven't met the needs that were identified 2 years ago, I'm going to guess that they're the same needs that we need now. And yet this is where we just go round and round. And again, it seems that there's that lack of evaluation, that we don't go, yes, we had this needs assessment and we have ticked off these things. That just seems to get missed. So
yes.
if we figure out how to fix that, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. I really feel passionately about this point, actually, that I guess because I also have seen, poor practice around this, where just to give sort of a slightly different example, what's written into strategy or policy sounds great, is exactly what people with lived experience were looking for. And then when it comes to the point of actually implementing what that states, there's a lot of dilution and a lot of reducing down of what was intended. And, we might end up getting maybe something approximating what was in the strategy, or maybe sort of half of what was intended to be there. And that just points to how critical the monitoring of implementation is, and the assessment of implementation through evaluation activities as well. We have to encourage all of our state governments and Commonwealth governments and primary health networks and other local organisations to follow through on these commitments that are made in strategy or at a framework level, and actually deliver properly, and deliver in a way which is consistent with those statements or those directions about the involvement of people with lived experience in a really meaningful and preferably leading leading way. So it is an area that continues to need a lot of work. There's even fields emerging in academia with names like implementation science to try to encourage
And then
people.
it's like, just do it.
Yes, that's probably a necessary starting point. And then there is also that, I guess, that additional question about the people responsible for implementation really having those skills and areas of expertise to really implement with integrity and with good faith what was already intended. Now, yes, we're probably getting
I've got so much more to say.
close to time now. Yeah, Caroline and I could talk about this for many hours, but we're really keen to take some of your questions and have a bit of a further discussion as well. So, Julia and Nick, I might just hand back to you as far as managing this part of the webinar.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm sure everyone online could listen to you both all day. I know Julia and I could, and there was so many comments that resonated. Stephen, thank you so much for that fantastic overview. It's so comprehensive, concise and accessible to people who are just coming into the suicide prevention space, but also for people who have been in this for some time, just providing clarity around those areas. And Caroline, you've had a few applauses and comments around your enthusiasm and really championing your words there. On the questions are coming in thick and fast, just around your frustrations around doing policy work. This one's for Caroline. One of the questions that's come through, how do you deal with the frustration of doing policy work?
I laugh a lot. It's a lot. Often it's one of those things, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. I do cry at times too. But I do laugh a lot. I do think for anyone who's just starting out and coming into this space, I would highly recommend that you go and watch the television series Utopia. It is very, very real. And I think I was reflecting on this the other day. So if people don't know, so Utopia is set in Australia in the last decade, a government organisation. And it's very much like Yes Minister, which was set in the UK back in the 1980s. And the fascinating thing to me is that they are very, very similar. They have the same underlying themes. And I do know some people who work in government that can't cope with watching Utopia because it's just so real. So often I do cope with it a lot by laughing. And I will sit in a committee meeting, and at times I'll just say, I feel like I'm sitting in an episode of Utopia, because it's so absurd that you either laugh or cry. So that's certainly one of the ways I deal with it. And I guess often what can happen is that I will have a cry about something. And I guess this is that idea of having a support network. So I might have a bit of a cry about it. And by the end of the conversation, we generally are laughing because we are reflecting on the absurdity of it. So that's probably how I deal mostly with the frustration, because it is really, really frustrating. It's really hard.
Thanks for that, Caroline. And I think that speaks to, yes, Stephen's beautiful presentation, as you were saying, and everything follows on and everything's just, has this lovely flow. But you're talking about the reality of actually working in that policy space, and that it's a very different world when you're actually experiencing it firsthand.
Yeah.
Now, we have had some comments in the chat around evaluation. There's been a couple of comments. One is the Resilient Family Social Benefit Bond had some really excellent evaluation to meet the KPIs around the bond. It may be worth looking at whether this can translate to this space. And we have another question around policy, around can we write evaluation into the policy? this person's an evaluation person and definitely not a policy person, but evaluation is often the last thing thought of, if at all. And that speaks to your point, Caroline, where you actually haven't seen an evaluation as yet.
Yeah, it's and I think we were talking about this, Stephen, that yeah, good policy should include evaluation in it. And I've got to admit that yeah, I haven't seen that. I think that is super important.
Mm. I think it's a really important tenet to push for explicit reference to the evaluation of suicide prevention programs in the policy work that you might be doing, because as Caroline mentioned, this is an area that our field really does need to improve upon a lot. There are a lot of initiatives that are funded that perhaps are not evaluated at all, or they may be funded and the evaluation may take place, many years later, even as sort of an afterthought as well. That's a somewhat common practice as well. Just the other point that I would make on this, though, very quickly, is the importance of evaluation results being made public. This is also something that we do see a little bit, where governments will commission evaluations and they will take place, but the community will never actually hear about or see the results of those evaluations as well. And particularly people with lived experience of suicide need to see that the suicide prevention activities that we're engaging in, that all of us are involved in, are effective and are being assessed to continue to be effective or to continue to improve.
That would reflect my experience. Like, I mean, I don't know whether things have been evaluated or not. I just know that I don't know about it. So you're right, it may be that it's happening, but it's not being made public.
Thanks for that. That's, yeah. Just going on to the, I'm just looking at the questions here, but just moving on to the implementation stage. I've had a question here come through. What are the key challenges for collaborative monitoring of implementation? Who's tasked with keeping this rolling?
So the responsibility for evaluation is really the same responsibility as funding. So essentially, again, this is theoretical, the way things are supposed to work. If you're funding a particular program or project or service, you should also be funding an evaluation of that program, project or service as well. So it really is something that needs to be understood as being absolutely part of the responsibility of whichever government agency or others may have funded the initiative in the first place. There was also just sort of a first part of that question, though, too, Nick, which I wonder if you might just want to repeat that, because I think it was quite a technical question as well.
This question, Stephen, yeah. What are the key challenges for collaborative monitoring of implementation, and who's tasked with keeping this rolling? Okay,
yes, thank you. There was just another aspect of that I would comment on, that I think very much people with lived experience of suicide do have grounds to request, demand, ask, that expect that the various government agencies that are funding this type of work are also engaging people with lived experience in ongoing monitoring and oversight of the implementation of those services or programs or policy that's being delivered. We generally haven't been involved in that sort of stage, actually. We've often been engaged in co-design. Maybe when it comes to evaluation, we might be, engaged in some research or something there. But in terms of this accountability for the implementation of these state, national and regional strategies, we really do need to see more people with lived experience involved in those processes. And as I said, particularly to build that sense of public accountability and transparency about the way that we're being involved in suicide prevention activities, and the value of those suicide prevention activities really being properly interrogated. Now, this is something that we are starting to see a little bit of improvement in. I think particularly the work that's going on in Victoria around suicide prevention policy is elevating that public accountability and public reporting of what is actually being implemented, and that's really encouraging to see, and I think something we should be looking for, you know, around the country as well as at the Commonwealth level as well.
Thanks, Stephen. Julia, I think there's a question here about another. Oh, sorry, Caroline. I didn't see your hand go up there.
Say, like, when I think about Stephen's presentation, when you talked about, like, you have the policy window and then you have that cycle, it kind of feels to me like it's like we need to be able to fit the cycle into the window. And what tends to happen is the window closes before you get to the implementation or evaluation stage. That seems to be the problem. We need to figure out how to make the window bigger or the cycle faster to get it to fit together, because that seems to be the problem. I think, like, it's like if there's a change of government or, you know, the new bright shiny thing comes along, then we move on before we've done the implementation and evaluation.
Absolutely, and I think that's also one of these more practical implementation points as well, isn't it, Caroline? Because you know, we do often see where policy has been delivered for whatever reason, but then there isn't the kind of engagement that you're referring to there as well. So there's certainly a number of areas for improvement around that too.
Thanks both. I think that, you know, you've raised some really important points there about accountability, public accountability, transparency, having lived experience involved in the implementation process, and not just in the co-design and the evaluation, even though, you know, the evaluation isn't even, you know, we can't see the evaluation yet. Julia, there was a really interesting one that's just come through that you may want to share with Stephen and Caroline.
Yeah, so we've got a great question here. Asking if you think whether one of the biggest issues with the lack of implementation of policy and the following on of evaluation of the policy is it because of a lack of connection and understanding of the importance of it? This person said that is it possible the people in government and or the people responsible for making these crucial changes are not really aware of what lived experience is, how it feels to be in these situations, or how close they could be to experiencing suicidal ideation or suicidal challenges. And they commented that it really is such a huge distance sometimes to the reality.
So I think I would just answer firstly, absolutely yes to that. I think unfortunately we're still quite a long way off your average government worker who's, you know, employed to work on suicide prevention policy, having that level of insight into what it means to participate as a person with lived experience. So there's definitely a lot of room for growth there as well. But the one thing that I would also just point out here is that often evaluations are not funded. So when budgets are put together for policy implementation, there'll be money for programs and different initiatives and so on, but evaluations themselves will actually just not be funded. So that basically creates, you know, inevitably that there will be no evaluation. So I think it's just another point to make there about the importance of evaluation being funded alongside every program, every service that we're delivering as well. And not just to find out if it works at the beginning, but if it works over time as well. You know, we sometimes see that where, you know, a bright new shiny thing will arrive, it'll be piloted or tested for, you know, a relatively short period of time. And if it comes sort of close enough then it'll get a big tick and a lot of money will be sent towards it. This is actually sometimes what happens when those policy windows, to go to your point before there, Caroline, open for relatively brief periods of time, and that more robust and cohesive cycle is collapsed, or multiple steps are left out because the policy window is only open for a short period of time, and that may be that period of time where an organisation has been able to lobby government and receive funds for whatever purpose it may be. So yes, there are all sorts of distortions that can go on in this process in the background. In my mind, it reinforces the need for people with lived experience to be involved, because we do bring a unique perspective when it comes to transparency and accountability, and the need for there to be public accessibility to what's being done in suicide prevention as well.
Thank you, Stephen. Caroline?
Yeah, it does seem to me that ultimately it does come down to what is funded. Because you're right, if an evaluation isn't funded, then it's not going to happen. And so I think it really highlights to me the importance of putting that evaluation piece in the policy. That part of the policy is that we need this evaluation. Because again, and I guess it's because a policy is that tangible thing. So it's like somebody will be tasked with writing the policy. They write it, they go, here it is. We can now put it on the shelf, tick, that job's done, we move on to the next thing. So you're right, there isn't that long-term investment, which is really hard. So again, if anyone out there knows how to fix that, that would be super. Because
just on that question around funding, we have had one come in. How can we stretch the funding timeline so that it moves beyond 12 months or 2 years and helps longer term stable initiatives remain viable and supported and encouraged to grow in capability and coverage over time?
Fantastic question. This, I think, is actually one of the biggest structural issues that our field faces, and I think both mental health and suicide prevention and drug and alcohol, there's a number of others that I know face this sort of problem, where the delivery of funds or the availability of funds is for such short periods of time that it's almost impossible to really set up a program, deliver it effectively, and know what the effectiveness of that initiative may or may not have been. That is an area that I think it's fair for people with lived experience of suicide. I know certainly plenty of non-government organisations are advocating hard on this as well, that we do need much longer funding periods, particularly in the environment we're in now, where there is relatively low unemployment. People are moving out of jobs and into other jobs quite quickly. It can be very difficult to stabilise a service in that kind of environment when your funding is only available for 12 months or for 18 months or 24 months. So I think in terms of the advocacy that all of us are engaged in, wherever and however we're doing that, encouraging these longer funding periods, into periods that are more like 3, 4, 5 years, is going to do a great deal for the stability of our sector and, of course, the reliability of our services for people who need them when they're in distress or crisis.
Thanks, Stephen. Caroline, did you want to add anything to that?
I have no answer.
Okay. All right.
Wish I had the answer. Really, it comes down to our whole form of government, doesn't it? Like the fact that the whole government can change every 3 years and whatever. So Yeah, I think that's what makes it so hard. Like, really, you need that, what's the word, bipartisan support for this stuff so that it can continue even if there is a change of government like that.
That is, if I can just make a point on that, that is also a factor in all of this to be considering, that sometimes governments can change and they'll tear up everything that was in place and want to kind of put their own stamp on how things are being done. It is in the interest of our sector for there to be greater continuity than that, especially when, from our perspective, we have invested so much of our lived experience in these policy development activities. We do need to see those, respected by successive governments, I think.
Thanks, Stephen and Caroline. Can you believe we are at 55 minutes?
Solved all the problems of the world.
Yeah, well, and now we can all go home. And I would like to thank you both for the most valuable hour this afternoon. We've all learned so much. I'm sure there is a raft of questions that have come through thick and fast while you've been talking. Of course, we will endeavour to answer all of those in the coming days, and also share the comments that people have made, because they're not all questions. There's some great comments that people have made in response to what you've shared with us today. So thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your knowledge and your time with us today. Stephen, just going back to your points on what we can all do in our own communities, start locally, understand your own state and territory. There's various activities that you can do within the policy landscape in suicide prevention. We will share this recording as well. We'll upload this onto our website, so if there are any elements that you'd like to go back to, you can look at those in your own time in the coming days. I'd like to thank everybody who has joined us today and for participating so vigorously throughout the session. It's been great to see your questions and comments coming through. Julia, how have you found today's session?
Fantastic. And I think it's just so refreshing that we can all come together and be very honest over the space that we're working in, but still find a passion, a willingness to continue and really make change that impacts everyone. And that's what I find so refreshing about today's session.
And I'd just like to finish with one of the comments that Leah Harvey wanted to share with us, which is thank you, Stephen and Caroline, for an interesting presentation. And at 72, I thought I was retiring, but I still have the fire. And I think we're all leaving with fire in our bellies today. So thank you so much for that. Julia, would you like to just finish off with the poll and talk about what's coming up next?
Thanks, Nick. So everyone, once you leave today's webinar, you will automatically have on your screen a very, very quick survey of just 4 questions, more of a poll than anything else, just to gauge how you feel about today's session coming away, so that we can also ensure that we're continuously improving on what we are able to offer our Lived Experience Collective. There's a reminder as well that we do have, as another part of the Lived Experience Engagement and Development Program, our community mentoring. The very next session is on Tuesday, the 23rd of April, with our incredible Sophie Hatch and Glenn Cotter. We also have our next session for the Learning and Development Program next month on Thursday, the 9th of May, and that'll be focusing on the sustainability of the suicide prevention workforce, and that'll be led by 2 of our staff members, Mark Ellis and Don Pizzuto. So we really hope to see you all again then, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.